Okay, so thank you very much, Philip, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 27th annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Anita Merzel-Todd, co-chair of this event, along with my fantastic co-chair, Susan Hain, wife of Philip, with whom members of this community are very familiar. So before we begin a little housekeeping, I just want you to take a minute and locate the nearest exits. Okay. Just in case there's any kind of emergency, and hopefully not, but also because out that exit there are extra bathrooms, I understand. So, you know, if you have that kind of emergency, you'd go that way, okay? Out that exit and down the hallway. So, now I've got a lot of thanks to give. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment to create this festival. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people who made it possible. First of all, thank you to Temple Sinai of Glendale for co-hosting this event with the Jewish Federation, and Temple President Philip Hain for introducing our program today. Also, Sisterhood President Ruth Devine and her Divine Sisterhood crew for providing the beautiful reception which will follow our program. Thank you also to our dedicated committee members. If any of you are here, raise your hand. Committee members, okay. Advanced readers? Nobody? Okay. The Federation staff and our tireless coordinator, Rebecca Russell. Where's Rebecca? Rebecca, there she is. She works so hard on this festival every year, and it just wouldn't be possible without her. She's great. We'd also like to acknowledge the Jewish Book Council in New York, from whose roster we chose all of our authors. And finally, our literary circle members, whose financial support makes this entire festival possible. Okay, so if you have not already done it, please turn off your cell phones and get ready for this afternoon's program. Okay, before the Untouchables, there were the Incorruptibles, that's right. They were a team of Jewish crime busters, and today Dan Slater will tell us all about why that came about in a presentation of his terrific book, The Incorruptibles, which will be followed by a Q&A. So please save your questions until after our authors talk. And if you wish to purchase this book or any other book from our festival, you'll be able to do so after the presentation at the Myra Weiss Memorial Pop-Up Bookshop. Myra was a longtime and much-loved member of the Book Festival Committee. After you buy your books, Dan will be available to sign them. So, let's see. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's author, Dan Slater. Dan is a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal and has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and many others. He has also written a nonfiction book, Wolf Boys, and the 2019 article, Undercover in the Orthodox Underworld. And after hearing such an impressive resume, Dan, we're just so fortunate to have you here today.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Thanks for coming. This is I live on the East Coast. I live in Connecticut. This is the furthest west I've come for a book event for this particular book. It came out 2 summers ago, July of 2024. And prior to this, the furthest west I'd been is Skokie. So this is a big trip for me, and I appreciate the sort of open arm welcome from Rebecca and Debbie and Anita. And we had an amazing lunch today with Jan, and I'm just so flattered and honored to be here. So thank you for coming. Anita had mentioned a 2019 article that was entitled Undercover in the Orthodox Underworld, which probably raises more questions than it answers. And I just wanted to, even though that's not the subject of my book presentation today, I wanted to talk about that project for just a minute or two, because it is how I discovered this story. Yeah, is this? Can I? Which one? The blue or the, what do you like, blue or yellow? What? Hello? Perfect. And I think I got a cool little thingy here to switch. Okay. So that piece in 2019, it was about a gang of rabbis. Again, raises more questions than it answers. A gang, what did they do to become a gang? Well, these were rabbis in the tri-state area in the Northeast. They were in the Orthodox community. And later on, the FBI would refer to them as the Get Crew, because what they would do, and maybe you have heard in Orthodoxy, if a woman wants to be released from the bonds of matrimony, she needs a get. This is spelled out in the Bible. It has been a rule forever, and it has been a sticking point and a problem in Jewish communities going back to the beginning of time, because there's always that odd guy who doesn't want to give the get for all kinds of reasons. Maybe he just doesn't want to be divorced. Maybe he wants some money from the wife's family in order to give the get. So this little coterie of rabbis had anointed themselves judge and jury on the issue of whether or not any given husband was refusing the get justly or unjustly. And if they deemed the refusal unjust, they would go and have a talk with him. Sometimes that wasn't enough. So there would be a van, and there would be a cattle prod, and there might be a broken bone here or there. And these rabbis worked with impunity for decades, until about 2010, 11, the FBI got wind of it. The reason they worked with impunity for so long is because local law enforcement tends not to get too involved in Orthodox affairs, because they live in the same place and they form a valuable voting bloc, and you kind of let people do as they do. But the FBI doesn't need your vote. And they got wind of this. There was a female FBI agent who specialized in undercover work, and she posed as a woman in need of a get. And over the course of 18 months, she kind of infiltrated her way into the middle of this community and busted the guys. And so I was fascinated by that story, and I spent a couple years working on it and reporting on it and getting in touch with all the relevant people and so forth, thinking that it was going to become my next book. It did not. It gravitated to a magazine story for reasons I can talk about later, about why one nonfiction subject is right for a magazine piece and why another subject deserves to be blown up into a 90,000 or 100,000 word book. But this became a magazine piece, but I did kind of book level work on it, and one of the things I researched was the history of Jewish crime. I wanted to see how far back did the get beatings go and so forth. And in the course of that research, information on get beatings was a few and far between, but I kept returning to the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side prior to World War I, because when you look into Jewish crime, that's just a time period, a place and a time that pops up a lot. And that's how I stumbled on the story that became the Incorruptibles. Now, during this time period, there was a lot of immigration to the Lower East Side, which you may have heard about. That immigration started in the 1880s, approximately. It was due to pogroms and massacres in Eastern Europe, largely in the Pale of Settlement, which was this, many of you probably know what the Pale of Settlement is. For those of you who have maybe heard the name but don't know exactly what it is, it was at the time the largest ghetto in the world. It was 17 provinces that essentially ran from north to south through Europe. And it was sort of like our southern border. There have been parts of our southern border, like Laredo, Texas, that have gone back and forth between Mexican ownership and American ownership for years and years. And many areas of the Pale had gone back and forth between ownership and eventually fell under Russian dominion. And it was, over the course of a couple hundred years, turned into the place where Russia stored all of the Jews. They kept them in one place, and there were certain laws in place that determined what jobs were available to them, where they could live, what industries they could work in, and so forth. And there was a lot of violence, there were a lot of massacres, and around the early 1880s, a lot of immigration began. That was following the assassination of the Tsar in Russia in 1882. I believe that of the assassins, there was only one Jewish person involved, and it was a pregnant woman whose participation was extremely tangential, but it kind of didn't matter. You blame the Jews, and a new wave of massacres was initiated, and people finally started to get out of there. So there was a ton of immigration. It starts off moderate in the 1880s. It gets bigger in the 1890s. And by about 1907, the Lower East Side of New York becomes not the largest ghetto in the world like the Pale of Settlement, but the most densely populated urban area in the world, surpassing Bombay, India for that title. And, you know, how did they work out the numbers? Well, the sociologists were at work figuring it out like on a per acre basis. And Bombay, which is the modern day Mumbai, had like 790 people per acre, and the Lower East Side had 850 people per acre, something along those lines. It was a very crowded place. I'm going to be showing a lot of pictures today, and I'll talk eventually about where these photos come from, because until you're seeing them now and until they were published in my book, these had sat in storage. All the photos you're going to see have been in storage for about a century. Here is, this is to me such an amazing photo, because you really see, this was 1912. We're somewhere probably in the East Village here, probably around Astor Place, looking down at the Lower East Side. You see the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. And here we are in the heart of the Lower East Side. We are on Orchard Street. People been to the Lower East Side? Anyone visited? A few people? Yeah, so this is the heart of the Lower East Side, Orchard Street, one of the hearts of it. Today, I believe on that corner is where the Tenement Museum is. If anyone's been in the Tenement Museum, and the bookstore is there. On this side of the street, behind where the camera is the Russ and Daughters Cafe. So if you do go back, Russ and Daughters has been, the original deli on Houston Street has been there for over 100 years, but the fourth generation owners, the great grandkids of the original founder who now run the place, they opened up the Russ and Daughters Cafe about 10 years ago or so, and it is amazing, really, really special. You can also order, they like FedEx you. So this is 1901, and it's buildings are low slung, doesn't look too crowded, looks kind of genteel, a place that might not be too bad to live. Here is the same area 10 years later. This is 1911. So you see it's getting a little bit more grimy, a little bit more ghetto-y. Again, it's now become, and this doesn't show the crowding necessarily, but you get a sense of what the ghetto had become. Living was very rough. To find relief from the heat of the tenements, you would often see families sleeping on the stoop outside at night. This is another amazing photo to me, because they would have had to illuminate this at night somehow to get the light to even take the photo. But you see mom and dad sleeping next to the kids. There's almost more children than you can count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plus the baby in the pram. It looks like the mom has tied the pram to her ankle, so no one can run off with their kid at night. Extremely stressful way to sleep. Families also slept on the fire escape if that was available. Again, the parents don't look to be getting too much sleep. They're worried about son, perhaps rolling off there, so they need to stay up. The kids in the streets, they found food wherever they could get it. Here's a little girl eating a knish, which was a delicacy then as now. The kids often went around shoeless in the streets, and some of them went around pantsless. You see the Yiddish newspapers here. That's the forward right up there. You'll see in a lot of these photos, you'll see a Yiddish newspaper in the background. There were 13 Yiddish newspapers in the Lower East Side at the time. The forward, I believe, is the only one that remains. I don't know if they still have a print issue. I think it's only online. And kids got into all kinds of trouble. Boys smoked. They hung out in front of the saloons. They drank those pails on that boy's left arm. Those are beer pails referred to as growlers, which is a name that's still in use a little bit. If you ever go to the breweries up in Vermont, you can get a growler to take away, but they're nice, glass bottles now. They're not the pails anymore. Yeah, right. Kids gambled. Gambling was huge on the Lower East Side, and they started early. Particularly the boys, they gambled on the stoops. They gambled on the sidewalks. And they got into trouble. This is an original photograph. On the back of the photograph, the photographer penciled "Jewish Oliver Twists." These are two pickpockets that were being taken off to prison for stealing. Obviously, this is actually a fairly early, relatively early photo. This is 1901. The paddy wagon taking some boys away. And there was a lot of drugs on the Lower East Side. The very first anti-vice laws, the ones we take for granted today as just part of the culture, they were all coming into being just around this time period. So here we have an opium den. Now, up until between about 1907 and 1912, which was when the stuff was being phased out and made illegal. Up until then, you could walk into your corner pharmacy and you could purchase more narcotics than we've even heard of today because it was all just available. You could buy opium 5 different ways. You could buy hash from this part of the world and that part of the world. It was in a big case. I mean, it was amazing. Cocaine, all this stuff was just freely available in the world. And now in, I think 1906, 1907, that's when the first state anti-narcotic laws start to pop up in New York and elsewhere in the country, and then those laws later on become federalized. And those anti-vice laws are going to become important to our story. So this could have been a legal opium den. It might have been an illegal opium den after the stuff was made illegal. Not sure. This was another common sight that you'd see on the Lower East Side. Here's an addict shooting up. This is a photo that was taken in 1910. There were also a lot of gangs on the Lower East Side. Again, we're talking about the most densely populated urban area in the world, a big ghetto. And these were the people who had invented the ghetto, essentially. The ghetto as a term goes back to Venice in the early 1500s. That's where it originated. It referred to the Jewish neighborhood in Venice that was created around 1510, 1515. It is a combination of an Italian word and a Hebrew word. So a lot of this stuff, you'll see a continuity if you look back through the history books. A what made the gangs in New York during this time period a little bit different is that in addition to just kind of fighting each other, which had been what the gangs of sort of other ethnicities had traditionally done in the city, the gangsters were commercialized during this era. So they would often be hired by different parties in the garment industry. Even though the Lower East Side is a big ghetto, the one thing it does have, which a lot of ghettos today don't necessarily, is it had this big flourishing industry. The Lower East Side had the garment industry, the Jewish garment industry that was owned and run by a combination of Eastern European Jews and German Jews. And most of the workforce was supplied by young Eastern European immigrant girls. And when I say girls, I mean actual girls, people younger than 18. And we're going to talk about that. So the gangs would often get hired out by different parties in the garment industry, particularly by the Hebrew labor unions. There were no labor laws at the time, really at all. Nothing to regulate hours worked, nothing to regulate minimum wage, nothing to regulate safety in the factories. And over time, the unions realized that without any laws to help us, peaceful protesting and unionizing isn't going to do the trick. It took them about 20 years to finally figure that out and become increasingly radicalized to the point where about 1909, 1910, a lot of violence is starting to creep in. And of course, the Hebrew labor unions would demand certain things. They wanted to be able to decide who the manufacturers could hire. And of course, there were a lot of manufacturers who resisted that. This is a manufacturer of men's shirts. The union had wanted him to be a closed shop, so they decide who he could hire. He refused and paid the ultimate price. This was a common thing. This was a common thing that would happen. The gangs took all kinds of different forms. One of the most amazing things I learned that I still really can't believe, even after going through court documents and seeing the photos and everything, was a particular kind of gang that I'd never seen before, and that was the Yiddish horse poisoners, which they did exactly what it sounds like they did. They would poison horses. Horse transport in the city was huge at the time. It wasn't until about 1912 that horses and automobiles shared the roads of New York City about 50-50. But horses were very important. If you owned any kind of business, particularly a small business that dealt in any kind of a perishable good, fruit, vegetables, ice cream, you needed to get that product to the buyer fast, and you needed your horses. And so the Yiddish horse poisoners preyed on that, and they would extort their fellows to the tune of many hundreds of dollars every month. And if you didn't pay up, you risked showing up to work one day and all your horses would be poisoned. Here is a letter. This is a photograph of a letter that these lovely people wrote to a poor business owner. I believe, we don't need to read the whole thing. I believe his name is Mr. Zausner. It says, "Mr. Zausner, we are now ready to do business with you. We demand from you the sum of $300. And then it gives them, the time and all the details of where the money is supposed to be delivered. And then at the bottom it says, "We are watching you all the time, so beware. If you fail to do as we ask of you, we will poison your horses." And there's the hand there, which is supposed to be a black hand, and that says Yiddish Camorra. Why did they also refer to themselves as the Yiddish Camorra? Well, they were taking a little bit of an Italian thing there. The Camorra, the black hand, that referred to the Italian mafia. The Italian gangsters were known for particularly brutal methods toward their neighbors. They would often kidnap a child and ransom him back. And so the Yiddish horse poisoners saw themselves through this same kind of lens and co-opted the name. So they were the Yiddish horse poisoners, they were the Yiddish Camorra, they were the Yiddish Black Hand, and they were very dangerous people. I'm not sure how this particular horse passed. This poor horse But again, there were about 70,000 workhorses in the city back then, and they were dying all the time from all kinds of things. The last thing they needed were horse poisoners. But they were sharing the road with automobiles, which were loud, which could fly off the street up onto the sidewalk. The horses had it very rough, and they were dying in the streets all the time. So there was a disposal van, or many of them, that would go around dragging the horses. So if you lived in New York at the time, that's another thing you would see every day when you went out. And depending on where you lived, the horses might not get picked up for a little while after they pass. So children who didn't have a jungle gym or anywhere to play or any green space to go to, you'd see them playing on the dead horses and stuff. So this is just one of those crazy things that historians discover when you start digging into the files. That's really amazed me. The biggest industry in the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side was far and away prostitution. Now, this is controversial, where there's not a lot of talk in Jewish books or amongst Jewish historians about the prostitution history. Jewish prostitution was very big in New York, did not start in New York, started back in the Pale of Settlement, and it came here. On the back of this photo, the photographer penciled Jewish prostitute. I'm assuming that refers to the young woman on the right. The young woman on the left looks like a garment industry worker. This is a ticket to a dance. There were a lot of dances on the Lower East Side, and that's where a lot of young women were sort of lured into the industry. One thing that made obviously there's prostitution everywhere. One thing that made Jewish prostitution unique was the organization of it. And that's a theme we see throughout this time period in the Lower East Side, was just the amazing organization of the underworld. That's something that had not been seen in America prior. There was a fraternity or a corporation or a union. They thought of themselves in this kind of way. These were the pimps. They referred to themselves as the Royal Benevolent Association or the Independent Benevolent Association. They had a hangout at 92 2nd Avenue. It was a little cafe they went to at 92 2nd Avenue. That's where they would gather to network and do business and pool their money to make sure that the cops were paid off every month. They incorporated. I have the bylaws and the corporate constitution that were on file in Albany. So they were pretty impressed with themselves. They would sponsor these dances. Here's the ticket. Here's the back of the ticket, which this is probably some sort of a copyright violation, but this was an Irving Berlin song from 1911. It was a big hit, and Irving Berlin, sort of one of the grandfathers of ragtime music. Ragtime music was known for many things, but it had a lot of these sort of sexual innuendos and sort of comedic things, and they thought this was funny, talking about resting your chin on the violin, etc., etc. Why are we looking at 111 2nd Avenue? So this is not where the pimps hung out. They were right across the street behind the camera. This is 111 2nd Avenue, and that is where the Jewish casino owners had their meetings. They referred to them, they were also incorporated. They referred to themselves as the Sam Paul Association, and they would gather at 111 2nd Avenue to take care of their business. So you see this incredible organization in the Jewish underworld. Now, while all of this was happening, there's, of course, a big backlash. Because if you're inclined to not want immigrants around, then information about those immigrants committing lots of crime become wonderful fodder to sort of march against them. And there was just this huge backlash from mainstream America. They saw the new arrivals as a threat to the country, as a threat to America for Americans, as they said. And The anti-immigration movement had sort of begun to coalesce a couple decades earlier, toward the end of the 1800s, and then it picked up steam in the early 1900s. They wanted to pass a law that would shut down the border. They wanted eugenics to play a role in deciding who could have a baby. And again, like I said, if you were part of this sort of nativist crowd, then the idea of Jewish crime becomes wonderful fodder for the policies that you want to see enacted. And this was not a minority viewpoint by any means. Here we're looking at a guy named Theodore Bingham. He was the commissioner of the NYPD, which at the time was a force of 10,000 police. Bingham oversaw the whole thing. And in 1908, Bingham writes an article in a very popular magazine called the North American Review, which we don't have anymore, but at the time it was kind of like the conservative Atlantic magazine or something like that. He writes an article in 1908 entitled "Foreign Criminals in New York," and in the piece he blames the city's crime problem on what he calls Russian Hebrews. He says, "It should be no surprise that a people who are naturally unsuited for physical labor and who lack language abilities should turn to poisoning horses and selling their daughters on the street." He wrote, "They are burglars, firebugs, pickpockets, and highway robbers when they have the courage. But though all crime is their province, pocket picking is the one to which they seem to take most naturally." As you can imagine, this piece really stirs things up in the city, particularly on the Lower East Side. I mentioned earlier there were 13 Yiddish newspapers servicing about 500,000 immigrants on the Lower East Side. All of these papers take a different position on Bingham's piece and what it means. Many of them say, hey, this is really anti-Semitic. Some of them take sort of the contrarian viewpoint of, well, he's kind of right. We have a lot of crime here. Others say, well, maybe he just misspoke. Maybe he didn't really mean what he said. Something we've heard before, right? In fact, Bingham did end up retracting the piece. He said, mea culpa, I based my comments on faulty data. But of course, the cat was kind of out of the bag. The sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic voice to which he gave permission became louder and louder in the following years, 1909, 1910, 1911. Now, while all of this is happening, there is another group of Jewish Americans in the city that are watching this with horror, and they are the wealthy German Jews who live largely on the Upper East Side. They live uptown. They had come here, their ancestors had come here a generation or two before the Eastern Europeans. Most of the German Jewish immigration to America was in the 1840s. And they famously did very well when they came here. They were coming from a land of oppression in Germany, but it wasn't as bad as the Pale of Settlement had been. There had been a Jewish Enlightenment in Germany around the turn of the century, that started in the late 1700s. So they were coming from a somewhat more enlightened land, and when they got here, they did well. We know many of their names because the names still adorn important institutions that are still around or have been around until recently. Lehman, Solomon, Goldman, the German Jews. By the early 1900s, the German Jews ran half of the investment banks on Wall Street. A German Jewish family, the Oxes, owned the New York Times. The Guggenheims, which later would become well known for their art support, they were making their money in the mining business. Who else? You had the Strausses, owned Macy's department store, et cetera, et cetera. These folks had built a lot in America, and now these co-religionists who they didn't feel a real strong connection to outside of religion were showing up from a much different background with much less to go on, and they meant a lot of different things to the German Jews. One of the things they represented was some embarrassment. Here are these folks from the backwater. The German Jews felt they had worked so hard to get where they were, and now they had these co-religionists coming in and tarnishing their reputation. And I think the German Jews, they also cared a lot about philanthropy. They cared a lot about America being an open place. They had benefited from that. They didn't want to see the border shut down. They thought that America, the whole idea of America, rested on some degree of an open border, and they didn't want to see that lost. So they were concerned. Just want to run through a couple of photos here to give you an idea of how differently they lived. This is the kind of mansion that the German Jews might have lived in on Fifth Avenue, which is now known as Museum Mile in Manhattan. This is where Jacob Schiff lived. Again, Schiff is not a name that we hear a lot today, but at the time he was kind of like the avatar of the German Jews. He was known in newspapers as the Jewish J.P. Morgan. He had inherited an investment bank from his father-in-law, and he had turned it into the second largest investment bank on Wall Street after Morgan's Bank. This is where he lived. This is the kind of place that the uptowners would have worked on Wall Street. This is the Cotton Exchange. This is what a stock exchange looked like at the time. If anyone has ever seen the movie The Sting, the great film, of course, here I'm in Los Angeles, so I'm sure some people have seen The Sting here. But, you know, some of the scenes take place in a similar kind of an establishment, not related to the stock market, related to horse betting, but it worked on a ticker tape basis. The information would come in and the numbers would get moved around. So this is really old school. This is how their wives might have looked when they were walking down the avenue with those big pre-World War I hats that everybody wanted to have, and the big muffs to keep your hands warm in the winter. This is how the uptowners' children would have played. They had the governesses in the background. They had the newest bicycles and toys. Instead of the kids being dragged off to jail for picking pockets, the cops were helping them cross the street to go to their schools. So, like I said, the German Jews, they wanted to fix the downtown problem. They had these poor ghetto dwellers who were struggling. They wanted to uplift these people. They wanted to bring them into the fold in America. And to that end, they established all kinds of initiatives that they themselves financed. Because there was no welfare state at all at the time. So anything that was done for a poor person back then would have been done at the benevolence of a wealthy person. There were lots of bread lines all over the Lower East Side, and soup kitchens. Controversial because of the same things you hear today. Some people, even the ghetto dwellers themselves, would say, we don't want it. We don't want to have reliance among our people. We don't think this is good. But the uptowners did it nonetheless. They did matzah giveaways on Passover, which may be less controversial, so no family would go without matzah on Passover. This is really interesting. Typhoid was one of the big problems, one of the big public health problems at the time. One of the German Jewish uptowners, it was one of the sons of the family that owns Macy's. He decided not to go into the family business. He became a public health scientist instead, and he sought to solve the typhoid problem with these milk depots, pasteurized milk depots, which is an idea that he got from France. France was doing this at the time. And so pasteurized milk for a penny a bottle, or sometimes for free, was supplied to the Lower East Siders. And then there was, of course, the labor issue. As I said, there were no labor laws to protect the labor force. There were really no serious or meaningful laws barring child labor either. So you'd often see, people in the street. You'd see laborers in the street. Lots of protests. If anyone has ever read a book or anything about the Lower East Side, the labor protests are the subject that tends to get covered the most in the history books. The Clara Lemlichs and these young women who stood up to the manufacturers. And then, of course, the Triangle fire. This is the one picture I'm showing today that is not from my own archive. This is a famous photo. If you go to the famous Yiddish library in Massachusetts, as you walk in the front door, they have this blown up to like the whole, it's like the whole wall in the entryway. It's a really, really amazing photo to me, because you see how young these people were. I mean, these were the girls who worked in the garment industry. I mean, I don't know, they're probably 14 or 15 years old. They might have come to America by themselves. They might have been living alone here. Life was precarious. You had the pimps throwing the dances, trying to get you into their thing, et cetera, et cetera. So the German Jews were trying to fix all these things, but the subject of Jewish crime was the big sticking point. It was a harder subject to address because the Lower East Siders were sensitive about it, and over the first decade or so of the 1900s, the Uptowners had tried certain things to make inroads against the underworld. None of them seemed to really work. But then something happens in the summer of 1912. This gentleman, his name is Herman Rosenthal, who was a product of the Lower East Side. He was an immigrant with his family from the Pale of Settlement when he was a kid. He becomes a famous casino owner, or notorious at least. And after a lifetime of toil, he's now 37 years old, and he's gotten permission from the police to open up a high-rolling casino in what was known as the Tenderloin District around Times Square. So he stakes everything he has on that, but what happens is the casino is getting raided by the cops, even though he's paying them off, and so he's getting angry, and he starts to make a big fuss about it, and he's going to the district attorney's office, and he's talking to newspaper reporters, and of course it's just a matter of time before Herman gets knocked off outside of the Metropole Hotel in Times Square. That's what 43rd Street looked like in the summer of 1912. Just to give you a bigger sense of Times Square, that's Times Square at night in 1911. The beginning of illumination, really. Those are the first billboards, gigantic billboards that would be animated. The lights would turn on and off to create this sense of actual scenes. It was really an impressive thing. There's no video of it, but I have read about it. It's really, really, really amazing. Here again, we are in Times Square, 1910. A drama of crime on the marquee. So the Rosenthal murder, because of a number of different circumstances, really becomes the most famous murder in New York, arguably anywhere during that time period. There were 4 people charged. 3 were young Lower East Side thugs, 2 of them Jewish, 1 of them Italian, and 1 was a cop, this fellow, who was alleged to have ordered the murder of Rosenthal. And there were lots of other peculiar circumstances around it that added to the intrigue. And so the Rosenthal murder was on the front pages of newspapers across the country and abroad for the next 3 years. As it goes through the trial system and the appeals, everyone is watching this. And it's bringing more attention to the problem of Jewish crime and the Jewish underworld. You're seeing headlines like this in newspapers. This is just kind of standard. The Jews, a race of gamblers. Nobody saw any problem with it. Maybe they wouldn't see a problem with it today either. I don't know. It was the most obsessed over murder case of the time. And 1 week after the murder of Rosenthal, the German Jews get together and they decide, like, look, we have to do something here. We can't do what we've done in the past. We can't do anything soft. We need to think outside the box. And what they do is they decide to contact this young man who is from the Lower East Side. They know him through his father. The father is a reformer, or had been a reformer, and his son, Abe Schoenfeld, right here, followed his father into the reform world, but really focusing on vice and trying to eliminate vice. Abe was born in the Lower East Side to Hungarian Jewish immigrants. He was kind of raised amongst the underworld. A lot of his friends were sucked into it. The young woman he fell in love with as a teenager turned to prostitution. He had a particular distaste for the underworld and for the bad attention that it brought to his people, and he was very invested in seeing it go away as well. So the German Jews contact Abe, and they pitch him this idea to essentially eradicate the underworld. Well, how are we going to do that? And they say, okay, well, let's start with the gambling business. Let's find out who they're paying off in the police department and try to shut that whole thing down. It seems like a kind of unlikely mission at the time, but in the first few months of Abe's work, sort of private behind the scenes work, he gets this job done and has some surprising success with it. So much so that the mayor of the city, whose name was William Gaynor, he says, I have an idea. Let's take this kid, he's 21 years old, and we'll install him in the police department. And we will let him choose which cops he wants to work with and which ones he doesn't want to work with, because he knows who's taking money and who isn't taking money. And for the next year or so, however long it can go on, roughly 1913, he can go around with his squad, which informally became known as the Incorruptibles within the NYPD, and shut down whatever he thinks needs shutting down. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't like the Untouchables later, 20 years later in Chicago, where you're just going after alcohol or just going after a particular syndicate. This was an entire diverse underworld, from the horse poisoners and the casino owners to the corporation of pimps and the pickpockets and the corrupt police who were facilitating it all, and the courts and everything. It seemed really, really unlikely. Certainly today, I don't think that would happen. But you had a mayor who was willing to think outside the box at a time when there were fewer rules surrounding what could and couldn't be done. And that's essentially the seed of my story. That's where the story begins. There are other characters who creep into the story. One of my favorites is a young woman by the name of Antonia Rolnick, who is known in the underworld as Tony the Tough. She briefly becomes Abe's paramour when he's a teenager. And I found her in the archives. I unfortunately don't have a photo of Tony, but she may have looked something like this. This is a silent film star named Theda Bara playing a vamp. Or something like this, a young woman taking on a couple of attackers. This is a staged photo. And there's another character who crept in, and if anyone has ever heard of anyone in my book, this would probably be the character you've heard of. His name is Arnold Rothstein. He was alleged to have fixed the 1919 World Series. That was the thing I knew him for. When I was a kid in the 80s, there was a movie that came out called 8 Men Out, which was a really cool movie if you were a little boy in 1986 or whatever, about that time period. I think Murray F. Abraham or something, or F. Murray Abraham, whatever his name, I think he plays Arnold Rothstein, which probably wasn't a great casting choice, but he was like if you needed an ethnic guy in 1985, he was your actor. Rothstein was known for that event in the history books. He was also known for his appearance in the great American novel under a different name, under the name of Meyer Wolfsheim. There's a famous scene in The Great Gatsby, and the character only appears in this one scene, but it's a famous scene in which you figure out basically all the information you need to understand the novel. you get through the character. And indeed, when F. Scott Fitzgerald, shortly before he passed away, he wrote a letter to a friend where he was talking about the genesis of Gatsby, and he wrote that if he had never met the real Arnold Rothstein, he didn't think the novel would have ever been written. So even though Meyer Wolfsheim only has that one scene, he was, in a sense, the seed of that entire thing. In my book, we are picking up Rothstein at a much, much earlier point. We're picking him up when he is a kid, a youngster in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And one of the interesting, even though he was obviously not part of the Incorruptibles, he was on the other side of the fence. But the reason that his narrative is wound through my book is because one of the patterns I saw is that while Abe Schoenfeld and the crime fighters are using all these new anti-vice laws that are just starting to come into being to wipe out the crime, Arnold is figuring out how to use those same laws to his benefit. Today, we know that if you make something illegal, you create a black market for the thing, and whoever is willing to take the risk of operating in that market can make a lot of money, and I believe Arnold Rothstein was the first person to see that here in the U.S., so that's how he got into the book. But Abe Schoenfeld and his Vice Squad, they were the seed of the book. They were the spine of the narrative. They were what got me into the story, and I hope they get you into the story as well. And I am happy to answer any questions that you may have about my process or about the story or anything. Thank you for having me again. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I can hear them. I can just repeat the question. Yeah. Yeah, so Murder Inc., again, that's something that probably more people have heard of because it's later. It's in the 1930s. The Murder Inc., it's kind of the remnants of this earlier world. It's sort of the last gasp. They were murderers for hire, and those guys often had their roots in this world. But by the time they're doing the things they become known for, the Jewish underworld, as it's depicted in my book, has pretty much declined. Yeah.
Their descendants went up there.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, I know.
Gotcha.
Anyone else?
In the book, you talk about the genesis of the Forward newspaper and how it sort of took a political turn. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it didn't seem to be very mainstream as it is today.
Yeah, so Abraham, there were a lot of Abes. Abraham, right? Super popular name at the time. So there were at least two Abes in the book, just Abraham Schoenfeld, who is the main figure in the book. He's sort of the Eliot Ness figure in the book. And then there's Abraham Kahn, who is known for founding the Forward newspaper. And he was a famous man of letters of the time. And he also was involved in other things like labor agitation. And he really became the beating heart, spiritually and financially, of the union, of the Hebrew labor unions that were going to war with the manufacturers, which, by the way, that was another element of the underworld that the crime fighters need to address at some point, is how we're going to remove violence from the garment industry. Another really incredible thing I discovered while working on the book is the extent to which the Forward was financing that violence. And I won't say anything more about it, but it was another weird narrative twist that I hadn't seen in a story before, or any kind of, of sort of a mob or a gang story, when it turns out that the newspaper is funding the hitmen. I mean, no newspaper today makes enough money to pay a hitman, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I've been reading the book, and I find the Abe Schoenfeld to be an amazing figure. He grew up with all these criminals on the Lower East Side, the East Side, and of course they turned against him
Yeah.
because he represents the morality police, if you will, trying to shut them down. And his life was in danger so frequently because of the work he was doing. And, one of the things that you talk about in the story, that one of his closest friends growing up turned out to be one of the killers of Rosenthal.
Yeah.
So it's, he really could have gone either way.
He could have.
Could have gone into the life of
Yeah.
crime, but instead he became the chief force to try to get
Yeah.
rid of that. He's a fascinating character.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's where the relationship with Abe and his father, I think, is significant, because he needed a model for that. He wasn't born with it, but he was raised by this really incredible figure who was trying to uplift the ghetto as well. He was not his father was not an uptowner. He was a local immigrant guy, but there were people like that who were willing to put their life on the line, which I thought was really inspiring. I mean, especially today when community activism, it's gone a bit more by the wayside. And back then, community activism was kind of the only thing. I would love to see the world return to that a bit. Yeah.
So, what was the perception of the people actually living in the neighborhoods? How much were their lives actually affected by the criminal enterprises and prostitution? Was it a fairly minor part, or did everybody feel it because they had to pay, protection money or whatever? But from the majority of the population, what would you say their
How did they
perception
feel
was?
about the underworld?
And how much did it affect their lives?
I think it affected their lives. Certainly, if you were a young woman on your own or out there in the world, you had this prostitution industry that wanted you. Your alternative was to work in a factory that wasn't a very pleasant experience either. If you owned horses, if you didn't want your son hanging out in a casino. So I think they felt that way. Interestingly, though, there were also people that were getting angry at the Vice Squad folks once they started to have success. These were people that owned small businesses that often benefited from the circulation, particularly of gambling-related money. They loved the gambling because it circulated cash in the community. People were winning and losing, and money was changing hands, and things were getting purchased. So there was even a bit of a backlash there. But I think for the most part, people wanted to see the underworld go, because it was a small minority of people who actually had a stake in it.
I actually had a question. You talk in the book about the fact that for a long time this story has been buried. Why do you think that was?
I think it was a few reasons. One of the reasons was more just a practical thing. A good portion of the archival material that I relied on for my research was moved to Jerusalem in the 1920s by one of the important figures in the book. He was a rabbi. His name is Judah Magnus. He was a very famous rabbi who founded. He later moves to Palestine and is the founder and the dean of Hebrew University. But back in the day, he worked with the uptown German Jews to eradicate the underworld, and he was sort of the spy handler who handled Abe. So the German Jews would hand over cash in their sort of edicts and instructions, and then Magnus would go to Abe and they would figure out how to carry it out. He collected all of Abe's writing. As Abe was waging this war on the underworld, he was writing an incredible amount, documenting everything, thousands of pages. All that stuff went to Magnus. Magnus later moves to the future Israel, and when he passed away in 1948, all of his materials got filed away in the basement of Hebrew University. So a lot of the most important stuff was over there. And then I think just, after the Holocaust, people don't want to talk about the rough spots. There's more shame. There's more sense of we need to be good and we need to project perfection to the world, and we can't. Maybe I'm taking this too far. Maybe now I'm just talking about my relationship with my mom or something. But but you know what I mean. And I we're talking about a corporation of pimps. I mean, this stuff is not always pretty. For me, I felt it was really important because if I'm going to go around saying I'm Jewish and claiming this identity, it's important for me to know what that means and what our history is. So one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Do you want to? We got a couple
We have
more.
one more question?
I'm wondering if in your research you learned more about the activities of the NYPD and did nativism and how nativism played a role in them maybe taking something like this squad and converting it into what in 10 years would be red squads that were, spying on political
right, in
activities.
1919 and stuff.
Yeah.
Don't know. I don't know enough about the Red Scare to know how much cops were involved. They were, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a big squad. Certainly there was plenty of anti-Semitism in the NYPD, as you'd see these days against lots of minorities. I've gone out on ride-alongs with NYPD people over the years, and I just see it. There's so much racism between the cops and the people they're policing. It's insane. But I'm assuming it was the same at the time. Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
So I see that the book was published in 2024 last year.
Yeah.
Have any descendants of either the victims of this underground criminal world or the perpetrators of this underground world reached out to you after reading this book?
Yeah. Yes. One in particular stands out, and that is a fellow who says that he is I would have to call up the email again. I believe he was the grandson of the head of the Yiddish horse poisoners, who was a fellow named Joseph Tablinski, whose story I was able to piece together through all kinds of documents, from court transcripts to newspaper coverage, but he was apparently Tablinski's grandson, and he sent me an email. And it was a very personal email. He was like, gosh, this is a really tough ancestor to have, but, we can't choose these things. So
Okay, thank you.
I think I was telling him much more than he knew, yeah.
All right, so fascinating. We could talk about this all day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So fascinating. Dan, can't thank you enough for a really great presentation. I love the book.
Some cool bookmarks, too.
Oh, okay. All right, I just have a few more things to say. We'd also like to remind you of two great upcoming book festival events. On Wednesday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., there will be a Zoom presentation by award-winning poet Owen Lewis, who will be reading poems, some of which were written in response to October 7th, from his book, A Prayer of Six Wings, which we have a copy of also back there. And then our big not-to-be-missed finale on Sunday, December 7th at 7:30 p.m., featuring #1 New York Times best-selling author Leigh Bardugo's book, The Familiar. It's a thrilling story inspired by Bardugo's own Sephardic roots and set during the Spanish Inquisition, a time of peril and miracles. Tickets for that one are going fast, so enough said on that. And one more thing before we adjourn to the social hall, let's do our raffle and see who wins some books. I'm going to mix these up, and Dan, I'm going to ask you to
Oh, cool.
pick one. Does somebody have the... In the podium. Okay, let's see. Right there, I guess. Okay. All right, let's see who the lucky winner is. Want to pick one? Okay, they got mixed twice, too.
828841. 828841. Congrats.
Okay, who's that? Oh, okay. Let me take this. Okay, what's your name?
Sheila Spiro.
Sheila. Congratulations, Sheila. You're welcome. Okay, let's see. And now let's all move to the social hall, where you can buy books, and of course, Dan is available to sign them. Thank you so much for coming today and for supporting the Jewish Book Festival. Yay. Thank you.